Once upon a time, not in my time, not in your time, but in somebody's time, on a day of weather much like the weather of today, a gravedigger was preparing a hole for a funeral that was to take place the next day. When he had finished digging, he sat on the grassy edge of the grave and drank a tot of whiskey. It's thirsty work digging a grave, so of course he drank another tot, and by then he could not resist another. Before long he was feeling drowsy, and falling into a thin sleep he tumbled down into the grave. Having steadied himself, he stood up inside the grave, shook the dirt off his shirt, and peered out over the edge. And what do you think he saw? 9 black cats. Yes, 9 black cats, each with a white spot on its chest. And these 9 black cats were marching along the church path towards the grave in which he stood, and they were carrying a coffin. A coffin covered with black velvet with a small gold crown on top of the black velvet. At every third step, the 9 black cats would stop and cry, 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, meow. The gravedigger kept very quiet, but he could tell that the cats were heading straight for him. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, meow. And when they got to the graveside, they stopped and looked directly down at the gravedigger, who by this time was shaking like a leaf on a wind-blown churchyard tree. Then the big black cat at the front spoke in a deep, masterful voice. "Tell Dildrum," he cleared his throat, "tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead." And then the big black cat turned his back on the gravedigger and led the others away, still carrying the coffin. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, meow. As soon as the group of black cats was gone, the gravedigger scrambled out of his grave and rushed home as fast as he could. And there, in his little house, was his wife Mary, sitting at the fire knitting, and old Mr. Tibbs, his own pet cat, lying in front of the fire snoozing. Everything was as it should be. Excitedly, he told his wife all about the 9 black cats, each with a white spot on its chest, carrying the coffin covered with black velvet and a small gold crown on top of it, and marching along 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, meow. Then he told her what the big black cat at the front said. "Tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead." But Mary just gave him one of those non-believing looks and said, "Yes, dear." "It's true, my love," cried the gravedigger. "I couldn't have made it up." But his wife just smiled as if to say, "Now, that's enough of your silly stories." But the gravedigger persisted, and this time he raised his voice, calling out, "Tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead! That's what he said!" "Oh, please don't shout, dear. You're upsetting Mr. Tibbs." And just then Mr. Tibbs, the cat, stood up on its old legs and started to prowl around the room. And for a moment he looked, well, aloof and somewhat royal. Then he looked straight at the gravedigger and asked, "What did the cat say?" Of course, the gravedigger was shocked to hear his own cat speak. But he thought he had witnessed so many strange things that day that it would be quite natural to answer Mr. Tibbs's question. The black cat in the graveyard carrying the coffin said, "Tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead." That's what he said, but how can I tell Dildrum that Doldrum is dead when I don't even know who Dildrum is? Just then the gravedigger's wife Mary called out, "Look, dear, look at Mr. Tibbs, look!" Mr. Tibbs had stood up straight with his head held up high, and now he was walking about with an air of superiority, acting as if he really was royalty. Then after swaggering about the room, he stopped, placed his right paw in his chest and said, old Doldrum dead, then I'm the king of the cats." And with that, he leapt into the fireplace and up the chimney and was never seen again. And if that is the end of the story, then that is all you will hear of the story.